Hello students and welcome to today's lecture. The topic for today will be ecological niche. This talk will cover the following objectives: the concept of the ecological niche, to understand the competition exclusion principle or Gause's principle, types and factors affecting the niche and its parameters, a brief idea of resource partitioning. Now, let us first discuss what is niche. The word niche is derived from a French word meaning nest. The term niche means more than just the address of a particular organism, the position it occupies within the community, the various interrelationships it has with other organisms around it, the role it plays in the operation of the community as a whole. In ecology, the term was coined by the naturalist Roswell Hill Johnson, but Joseph Grinnell was probably the first to use it in a research program in 1917 in his paper, The Niche Relationships of the California Thrasher. The Grinnellian niche concept embodies the idea that the niche of a species is determined by the habitat in which it lives and its accompanying behavioral adaptations. In other words, the niche is the sum of the habitat requirements and behaviors that allow a species to persist and produce offspring. In 1927, Charles Sutherland Elton, a British ecologist, defined a niche as follows: the niche of an animal means its place in the biotic environment, its relations to food and enemies. Thus, Elton classified niches according to foraging activities, that is, food habits. Clarke in 1954 distinguished two separate meanings for the term niche: the functional niche and the place niche. Clarke noted that different species of animals and plants fulfill different functions in the ecological complex and that the same functional niche may be filled by quite different species in different geographical regions. Conceptually, the Etonian niche introduces the idea of a species' response to and effect on the environment. Unlike other niche concepts, the Eltonian niche emphasizes that a species not only grows in and responds to an environment based on available resources, predators, and climatic conditions. A species may also change the availability and behavior of those factors as it grows. Odum in 1959 defined the ecological niche as the position or status of an organism within its community and ecosystem resulting from the organism's structural adaptations, physiological responses, and specific behavior. He emphasized that the ecological niche of an organism depends not only on where it lives, but also on what it does. For Odum, the habitat is the organism's address, whereas the niche is its profession. The term, as we wish to define it, embraces not only the organism's community type, habitat, and physical requirements, but includes some element of its relationship with all other components of the community. Almost every facet of its population dynamics, periods of increase and decrease, factors controlling its numbers and distribution, almost every element of its interaction with other parts of the community, feeding relationships, relationships as prey, competitive interactions, and so on. In fact, niche as a concept embraces almost the whole ecological functioning of a particular organism within its community. The niche concept was popularized by the zoologist G. Evelyn Hutchinson in 1957. The Hutchinsonian niche is an n-dimensional hypervolume where the dimensions are environmental conditions and resources that define the requirements of an individual or a species to practice its way of life, more particularly for its population to persist. When reduced to single dimensions, the niche may be defined in terms of the set of resources which are occupied by an organism. Such niche is of course ultimately constrained by the physiological limitations of the organism concerned. Now, what is fundamental and realized niche? The entire set of resources which could physiologically be used by any one organism is normally referred to as its fundamental niche. Hutchinson designated the entire set of optimal conditions under which a given organismic unit can live and replace itself as its fundamental niche. It is thus a hypothetical idealized niche in which the organism encounters no enemies, such as competitors or predators, and in which its physical environment is optimal. In practice, however, the organism rarely occupies this entire fundamental niche, the limits of which are effectively set by abiotic factors alone. Various biotic factors, competition, predation, and relationship with its own food resources combine to restrict it to a far narrower area of operation. Its actual position defined as the realized niche is usually only a small part of the potential, fundamental or pre-interactive niche. The realized niche may be defined, as we have said, in terms of the set of resources exploited by an organism or by a population of organisms and the relative extent of use made of each of the different portions of that resource set. For example, within a forest, a population of sparrows feeds on berries that grow abundantly on bushes. The fundamental niche of the sparrows is the area where there are berries and covers the whole of each bush as well as the forest floor where many of the berries have fallen to the ground. However, mice which live on the forest floor also like to eat berries and are quick to collect them once they have fallen. The presence of mice causes interspecific competition and means that there are fewer or no berries to eat on the forest floor. The fundamental niche of the sparrows cannot be met, so they fill the realized niche, which is the area on the bush branches only. We can portray this diagrammatically. If a set of resources is visualized in terms of some continuum along one axis of a graph, and extent of exploitation of various portions of that resource continuum is represented by the other axis, the niche may be seen upon this plot as the defined area enclosing the range of the resource continuum used and showing relative proportion of resource use at each point. Set theory model of the fundamental niche, stippled and cross-hatched, of species G and its realized niche, that is cross-hatched, which is a subset of the fundamental niche after competition and complete competitive displacement due to 6 superior competitors, species A, B, C, D, E and F. Coming to the question, what are the important features of niche? Ecologically speaking, the most important features of a niche are its position on the resource continuum, its spread, and its overall shape and form. The niche position and form relate to the role of the organism within its surrounding community, describing the relationship of that organism to all others which may utilize the same resource continuum, while one of the most important descriptors of the niche itself is its spread. The niche width is the measure of the breadth of exploitation of a given resource by an organism. It is a complex function of how much of a generalist or specialist the organism may be in that particular element of its ecology. Niche position and niche form of the individual are determined by its own individual abiotic tolerances and its own competitive or other interactions with other organisms around it of its own or different species. The niche position and niche form of the population or species is derived as the envelope of the separate niches of its component organism, and because of its variability between different individuals within such a population. The niche described for the entire population may have different limits and a different form from those described for any individual. Parameters of niche. Ecologically speaking, the most important features of niche are position, spread, overall shape and form. Factors affecting niche and its parameters. Various factors combine to determine the shape, width and position of niche. That is interspecific competition, intraspecific competition, predation, stability and predictability of resources. Any niche of an individual of a population may be defined in on-resource dimension in terms of its position and spread with regard to that particular resource continuum and the extent of use of different portions of that distribution. Various factors combine to determine the shape of this niche, combine to influence niche width and position. The position and range of the fundamental niche are determined by physiological characteristics of the organism itself in relation to abiotic factors of the environment. Individuals within the population will show normal variation in temperature, tolerance and the extent of use of each part of the temperature gradient overall by the population will thus show normal distribution over its full range. However, in practice, the organism may never occupy that full niche. Other factors, largely biotic, may restrict the range of temperatures used and shift the mean of the actual realized niche expressed. Introduction to another species of flatworm into our freshwater system, offering competition to the first, may radically affect the actual niche occupied. In more general terms, there are a number of factors which thus determine the breadth and position of the realized niche within the overall potential, which may be summarized as predation, distribution and predictability of resources, and perhaps more importantly, inter- and intraspecific competition. Interspecific competition causes specialization of both individuals as of the species as a whole. Intraspecific competition causes specialization of individuals alone. Predation, like interspecific competition, acts to restrict the position of both individuals and population niches and to reduce overall niche breadth. Predictability of resources sets the limits to which the niche can be restricted by other pressures such as competition and predation. Now, What is resource competition or the competitive exclusion principle? The most studied of the competitive interactions are those in which there is a common environmental requirement that is in short supply, resulting in either passive or active competition for that resource. Independent of each other, Lotka in 1925 and Volterra in 1928 developed mathematical formulations relating to competing populations that indicated that only one species will survive. Because of his empirical studies on competing populations that showed this effect, this principle is referred to as Gause's principle. It is also known as the competitive exclusion principle, so named by Garrett Hardin in 1960. Gause's studies on paramecium. Using a culture medium conducive to the growth of two species of paramecium, that is, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum, Gause determined the growth pattern of each when cultured separately and together. Each population has a typical sigmoid growth pattern when grown separately, as well as during the first 6 to 8 days when grown together. In the latter situation, however, there is a gradual diminishing of caudatum and a gradual increase in aurelia, but not to the level attained when cultured separately. These results are consistent with the competitive exclusion principle predicted by mathematical theory. Comparable results have also been obtained in the laboratory with various competing populations, including other protozoa, yeasts, hydras, fruit flies, and among plants, the small floating aquatic duckweed, that is lemna. Niche overlap. It occurs when two or more organismic units use the same resources or other environmental variables. In general, where niche overlap does occur as described, this is indeed only when the resource in question is superabundant. As soon as resources become limiting, each species withdraws from the zone of overlap and ecological separation is re-established. Thus, in our food niche, examples above, each species has one particular food type or set of food types characteristic to itself. Exemplifying Darwin's finches. In his famous On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin in 1859 forcefully presented his case that the struggle for existence occurred where interspecific competition played a major role in determining the outcome of the struggle. As species of the same genus have usually, though by no means invariably, some similarity in habits and constitution and always in structure, the struggle will generally be more severe between species of the same genus when they come into competition with each other than between species of distinct genera. In contemporary terms, this is niche overlap. Among the evidence advanced to support this thesis, Darwin offered the case of the 14 distinct species of finches occurring on the Galapagos Islands. He contended that the existing species were all derived from a small number of generalized finch-like birds evolving into different species occupying different niches. This cohort of species includes 6 ground feeders, several of which have heavy beaks used in crushing heavy coated seeds, whereas The remaining 8 species are adapted to perching in trees and feeding on insects, largely by removing the bark with their beaks. One species even drinks blood. Among the most specialized is the so-called cactus finch, which plucks a long spine from a cactus, holds it in its beak, and uses it to probe crevices of the cactus stem for insects and to remove them. It is generally conceded that these 14 closely related species continue to live side by side, avoiding competition by niche diversification or niche shift, a change in some pattern or process in the niche. Niche conservatism. Niche conservatism, or the degree to which plants and animals retain their niches and related ecological traits through space and time, is a classic concept in ecology receiving renewed interest in recent years. Phylogenetic niche conservatism. Phylogenetic niche conservatism refers to the tendency of closely related species to be more similar to each other in terms of niche than they are to more distant relatives. A tendency towards conservatism has been demonstrated previously on the local and regional scales, and now a study of more than 11,000 plant species from across the southern hemisphere confirms a similar phenomenon on a global scale. What is the importance of niche conservatism? Niche conservatism is important because of its relevance to predicting species responses to global change, since a tendency towards conservatism would mean that species have only a limited capacity to adapt to new environmental conditions. Those species would be particularly vulnerable to environmental change. Conversely, conservatism also implies that spread of invasive species is limited by the environmental conditions of their native ranges, laying robust foundations to predict the extent of potential invasions. Coming to niche separation. The opposing forces of inter- and intra-specific competition obviously play a powerful part in shaping the realized niche. Beyond this, competition can have no further effect on niche width, but as a consequence of its action in fashioning the individual niches to begin with, it has already had a secondary effect that the roles of the various organisms within the community are sharply distinct. Each niche is clearly separated from all others in the phenomenon of ecological or niche separation. Resource partitioning. Competitive exclusion may be avoided if one or both of the competing species evolves to use a different resource occupying a different area of the habitat or feed during a different time of day. The result of this kind of evolution is that two similar species use largely non-overlapping resources and thus have different niches. This is called resource partitioning, and it helps the species coexist because there is less direct competition between them. The anole lizards found on the island of Puerto Rico are a good example of resource partitioning. In this group, natural selection has led to the evolution of different species that make use of different resources. The figure shows resource partitioning among 11 species of anole lizards. Each species lives in its own preferred habitat, which is defined by type and height of vegetation, that is trees, shrubs, cactus, etc., sunlight and moisture among other factors. That was all for today's topic. Let us retaliate what we learned about ecological niche. We understood the concept of niche and its factors and parameters. We also understood the difference between the fundamental and realized niche. Then we had a brief overview of the Gause's principle, and we concluded by understanding the idea of resource partitioning. Hope you understood, and thank you.